put in place for a long, long time. I'm so glad that we were able to work with your staff to do that. I just wish we could have you here in person. Welcome.
I wish so too. We'll have to try to work that out in the future.
Well, let me introduce you to our audience. I am Peter Feaver. I'm the director of the American Grand Strategy Program here. And part of what we do is our mission is to raise the next generation of strategists by learning from past generations and speaking with the current ones who are running it. And of course, there's no one better than you. You've had a very distinguished career as a career diplomat, a member of the Foreign Service. You rose to the highest career post as Director General, where you were raising the next generation of Foreign Service officers. And you also were the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs under the Obama administration. And then President Biden called you back from retirement and asked you to serve the country once more, now as ambassador to the United Nations. And so this is an important post. I've got lots of questions, but first I just want to give you a chance to say what you'd like to say.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here with you, Dr. Feaver, and I wish I could be there in person. But let me just start by thanking all of you for the American Grand Strategy students and faculty who are joining us today. What you're doing is so, so important. So I just wrapped up what has been an extraordinarily busy day in DC. Normally I am in New York, but in my cabinet position, I have an office here in DC. So not doing this from New York, doing it from my DC office, but I'm really excited about the conversation that I think we're going to have. There's nothing I love more. This is what we're doing. What you're doing is more important to me than what I do every day. And that is engaging young people so that we make sure that they are prepared for the future. So in the past year, I've met with students at Tougaloo College in Mississippi. I've gone to the University of Wisconsin. I've gone to Howard University, as well as Georgetown, Chicago State University, just to name a few. And all these are great schools, but even with my limited knowledge of sports, I know that none match your basketball prowess. The Blue Devils, love them or hate them, are pretty outstanding. So let me just say that, or my team would give me a hard time. I will tell you that my chief of staff wanted me to say something that would annoy everybody. I decided I wouldn't say it. It's something that starts with a T and ends with Hill. And she said, I'll bet if you say that, I'll pay you. And everybody on the screen said, do not say it. So I didn't say it, but I'm letting you know that she tried to get me to say it.
I appreciate that you're a good diplomat. You're a very good diplomat.
I'm a good diplomat. But Duke University excels off the court too. And the American Grand Strategy Program is a perfect example of that kind of excellence. By taking part in this program, doors are already opening up for students, and the world is opening up for you, I say to the students. My hope is that you will seize this opportunity and that you will consider a career in the Foreign Service and public service because we really need you. The world you inherit is going to throw all kinds of challenges your way. Your generation will have to face down dictators and threats to democracy. You're going to have to deal with climate catastrophes and the future pandemics. And as I generally say to students, we've kind of left a mess for you. So we need to prepare you better than we were prepared to address this mess that you will inherit. We will need you to find solutions to the challenges that face you, to be able to take on the world where the environment isn't always welcoming and transform it into a better, safer, and kinder place. The good news is that the American Grand Strategy Program is preparing you for this weighty responsibility through rigorous coursework and opportunities to travel abroad, through the relationships you're building with your peers and professors, through programming like your recent conversation with the U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, and the one that we're having together today. Now, there's a lot that we can discuss today. I want to talk about what's happening around the world. I want to talk about how the United Nations works and why U.S. multilateral engagement and coalition building is so important. I want to talk about Russia's war in Ukraine, especially because I was just in Ukraine last week, Wednesday. I also visited Albania, which is a member of the Security Council, in Poland, to meet with refugees, to meet with government officials and civil society leaders. And as I've already alluded to, I also want to talk about different pathways into public service. There are so many pathways, from Peace Corps, which I encourage young people to consider, to the Foreign Service, where I started my career in public service, to opportunities at the United Nations. But above all, I want to hear from you. So I encourage you to pepper me with questions. I want this to be an open and frank conversation. So without any further ado, I'd love to kick this off. So
Well, thank
you, Dr. Feaver.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, and thank you for those kind comments about the Grand Strategy Program. Let me pick up where you left off and the various career paths. We've hosted your predecessors, the last 4 or 5 of your predecessors here, and most of them, so I'm thinking now of Ambassador Haley, Dr. Rice, Ambassador Power, and Ambassador Bolton. They all came from the political side of the House. I think we have to go back to Ambassador Negroponte, who we've also hosted, to find a UN ambassador who was groomed from within the State Department. So talk to us a little bit about the pros and cons of the path that you took to be at the UN. I'm not talking about the rewards you got along the way, but are you more effective because you are a career Foreign Service officer or not?
You know, I think we all bring different skills and different experiences to the table. So I wouldn't say I'm more prepared than my predecessors. But what the value I do bring that I think political appointees don't have is a knowledge of how the State Department works, and an appreciation for the work of career officers. So I think that's an important bit of experience that I have. My experience as a diplomat. So I'm not a political animal. I'm truly a diplomat. I have engaged with people from all walks of life all over the world. That experience has served me well in the time that I've been here in New York. And I think that has been, it has somewhat contributed to the success that we've had in the past year and a half.
Now, when you attend a White House meeting, it's possible that you'll have 2 of your predecessors sitting in the room. I realize Dr. Rice has the DPC as domestic policy now, but I'm sure your paths cross. And of course, Samantha Power is USAID. Does it help to have so many former cooks in the kitchen, or is that a mixed blessing? And I'm sorry to put you on the spot like that.
It does put me on the spot. It's not the first time it's happened. I was Assistant Secretary for Africa when Ambassador Rice was National Security Advisor. So imagine that your National Security Advisor had your job. So it keeps you on your toes. So it's a mixed blessing, because sometimes I would ask, what would Susan do? How would she have handled this? Or now at the Security Council, what would Susan do? What would Samantha Powell do? What would Ambassador Kraft do? Because they're all around. I engaged when I learned that I had this position. I called every living US UN ambassador, and I spoke to them all, from Ambassador Bolton to Negroponte, Pickering,
Craft.
Ambassador Kraft. In fact, Kraft was one of the first I spoke to because she was sitting in the position, and she's been an extraordinary advisor and friend even now. Because she was most recently in the job. So you learn to build on the successes of your predecessors, and you learn from the mistakes they might have made. I'm certain that whoever replaces me in this job will look at my successes, but also look at places where I didn't succeed and learn from that. So I don't see it as a problem. I actually see it as somewhat of a positive that so many predecessors are still around.
Well, I appreciate the comments you made about bipartisanship, reaching across the aisle. There's something of a bipartisan consensus of frustration that the UN hasn't lived up to its full potential. And that frustration ranges from a more extreme end, say on Dr. John Bolton, who's very eloquent on this subject, but even folks like Ambassador Power or Dr. Rice, they would all likewise point out ways in which the UN is not yet living up to its full potential. In your experience, what have been the times when you said that's the UN doing what they could do, and what have been the times you say that the UN is missing its moment?
You know, the UN is not perfect, and I am the first person to admit that it's a flawed organization. It represents all the flaws of its 193 members who bring to the table all of their national interests, and national interests compete with each other. They are in conflict with each other. So that's something we constantly have to be conscious of. But if I could share a couple of things that have happened recently, the UN really stepped up to the plate during the Ukraine, the food crisis that has resulted from the Ukraine war, the attack on Russia, by proceeding with the Black Sea initiative that has untrapped millions of tons of wheat that was blocked in the Black Sea, got Russia and Ukraine, who are still fighting each other, to the negotiating table with the Turkish government and the UN, and hammered out a deal that got this wheat out to the markets and mouths of people in Africa and the Middle East, Europe, and elsewhere. This is what the UN ought to be doing. This is an example of the UN at its best. The place where I find the most concern is something we're talking quite a bit about. The system is somewhat broken. It's not representative of the world. We have a Security Council with 5 permanent members and then 10 elected members who are not representative of the broader global South, who has a voice, and they vote in the General Assembly. And what I'm proud of is that we've been able to bring all these disparate voices together to vote to condemn Russia in Ukraine after Russia used its veto in the Security Council. We brought these disparate voices together to condemn Russia's annexation. 143 votes, more than the 141 that we got for condemning them, to again condemn the annexation. So the system can work, but there are some flaws in there that make it sometimes harder to work. But I think it was Secretary Albright, another predecessor who sadly passed away a few months ago. It was Secretary Albright who said, if we didn't have the UN, we'd create it. Because there's nothing else that we have that brings together all 193 countries around the world. Not perfectly, but again, we've been able to make it work when we've needed to.
One of the points I emphasize with my students, and I wonder if you feel the same, have noticed the same thing, is that even our partners and allies, close partners and allies, would prefer us to work through the UN if possible, that it is, from their point of view, a legitimating institution, even when they would be willing to work with us outside if necessary, that it's preferable, they're saying, to do it that way. Is that your experience? And if so, does that limit us with, bogged down in trying to make an unwieldy system work when speed might be more efficacious?
We can always move forward bilaterally on or directly on any issue that we feel strongly about. But it's always better if we can bring our allies and friends and sometimes our foes around the table and come together to make a decision that everyone agrees to. So again, it is flawed. But I will tell you, when I came back and we rejoined the Human Rights Council, what I heard over and over again from friends and foes, we're happy you're back. For those who were friends, they said it was hard for them to raise their voices when we were not sitting beside them. They needed our backing, our support, our sort of pushing to have their voices heard. And so they welcomed us back into the council. And I would say even our foes welcome us back, because when we were not there, they didn't have anything to fight against. They filled in the vacant space and took over in places where we were uncomfortable with their moving in that direction. So we've given them something to defend. And we're fighting back, and sometimes a good fight is worth it, even when you don't always win.
Well, let me pick up the thread you dangled there about the Russia invasion and the UN's response to that. You noted the vote, 141 for 143. And of course, that's a good number, but some people were surprised at who abstained and who just didn't rise to the occasion, given how blatant a violation of the UN Charter it was. So can you speak to that? Why do you think so many countries that might have been, you would have expected them to be on side, weren't on side?
Countries have bought into the narrative that this is a war between Russia and the United States, that this is the Cold War over again, and that they can gain nothing by siding with one side or the other, that their best place in all of this is neutrality. And what we've said is you cannot be neutral when there's an attack on the Charter, that this is not about the US and Russia. It's about a blatant attack by Russia on the sovereign borders of Ukraine. And so while the numbers, we didn't get 193, there were only 5 countries that voted with Russia, including Russia. It was Syria, it was DPRK, Eritrea, Belarus, and Russia. I mean, even China abstained and didn't vote with Russia on this. So I think we made a strong statement with the 143. I am constantly, it's hand-to-hand kind of combat. You literally are on the phone constantly, you're texting countries constantly, you're calling countries every single day. You are engaging our ambassadors in those countries. We're engaging people here in Washington to engage with capitals. So it really is an activity that requires a tremendous amount of work. Russia, of course, is doing the same thing. They're doing it in a different way. They're threatening countries that if you don't vote with us, we're not going to support you on this or that, or I can promise you we will not continue to have a normal bilateral relationship. And countries shared with us the letters, the threatening letters, because the Russians put it in writing that they were getting from the Russians. So many of them just threw their hands up and said, I'm going to abstain, or I'm just not going to be present in the room when all of this is happening. I can't win. So again, we do have a lot more work to do in engaging those countries, particularly in Africa. Countries in Africa tell us we don't care about them. We ignore them in their time of need, and they don't see us calling them until we need them. I think because of my long experience in Africa, I was able to get more of the Africans on board than we might have ordinarily gotten, but still a lot more work to be done.
And do you see the ground shifting? Is there a tide rising in support of Ukraine, or are the lines now pretty much frozen in diplomatic terms in the UN, I'm saying?
You know, I don't think they're frozen. I think countries want this to end. They don't see that they are benefiting from this. Their economies are being impacted. Their food security is being impacted. So they want it to end. And what I hear from them regularly is that we need to find a diplomatic way to end this. And what we've said to these countries, we're not stopping you from seeking a diplomatic approach. Our approach is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, that Ukrainians have to be in the driver's seat on any negotiations with the Russians. The Russians aren't ready to negotiate because they can end this war tomorrow. This is, in fact, for the Russians, there's no negotiating necessary. All they have to do is take their troops out of Ukraine and the war is over. So we're encouraging countries to encourage the Russians to pull their troops out of Ukraine. But we know, and Secretary Blinken has been clear on this, if the Ukrainians stop fighting, it's the end of Ukraine.
So I want to just ask you about the diplomatic options. General Milley, who's another friend of the AGS program, spoke here last year, recently mused in public that the time for negotiations might be ripe, or riper now than they've been for months. Coincidentally, you were visiting Ukraine. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan was also there. I don't know if you all overlapped, but you were there in close proximity time-wise. It seemed to outsiders like there might be some movement, and indeed the President Zelensky changed slightly some of the terms for the negotiation. So is this all part of a culmination of a diplomatic launch, or are we overreading it, those of us out here in the cheap seats?
I think you're overreading it. What this is about is really reasserting and reaffirming our support for Ukraine. And if there's a time that is ripe for negotiation, it's because we have worked with the Ukrainians to put them in a stronger position so that they can negotiate and get a fair deal, to get justice for what the Russians have done. But our engagement with Ukraine has clearly been to reaffirm that our strong support, our strong commitment to Ukraine's efforts to defend itself.
So let me ask you about China. You mentioned that the U.S. left some of the UN system sub-organizations briefly. One of the countries that did not leave is China. China is now much more pervasively present at the diplomatic level across the UN system. Talk to us, does that matter? Is this just jobs for Chinese diplomats? And if it matters, in what ways does it matter?
It matters. It matters significantly, because what the Chinese are after is changing the international order, re sort of re defining the values that are underpin the core of the UN Charter, taking the human out of rights, giving the rights and sovereignty of a country greater currency than the rights of individuals. So given if they had their path, the UN system would not be what we all signed on to 70 some years ago. It would be a system in the that is in the vision of the Chinese, one that reflects their core value of the rights of the nation over the individual. So it is important that we stay engaged. And yes, they have put a lot of Chinese diplomats on in UN positions. We need to up our game in encouraging more diplomats, such as your students, to consider UN jobs as opportunities of the future. We're encouraging more young Americans to look at the United Nations, to do internships and JPOs, because the Chinese are paying for dozens of JPOs, and that's where getting into the
define
UN
JPO for the
I'm
students.
sorry, it's junior professional officers. So they're entry level. They're paid for by government. So an American JPO would be paid for by the US government for 2 years. But those 2 years provide them with the experience, and it gives them a launching pad to move
They're
into
basically
the UN.
detailees to the UN, is what you're saying.
You're interns, basically, paid for by your government to work in the United Nations. And then the hope is that the UN will hire you into more professional positions. So if we are to keep this organization focused on the core values of the Charter, we need to have like-minded. So it's not just Americans and like-minded working in this organization to build up the value system that we all support.
Some critics have said it's not just the number of Chinese diplomats, but it's also the tone that they've detected shifted over the years. Even the most recent U.S. ambassador, Chinese ambassador to the U.S. was tonally very different from his predecessor. He's now gone back to be a senior post in the foreign ministry. Does the same thing happen at the UN, that these are so-called wolf warrior diplomats?
Less so at the UN, but they represent the interests of their government. So I've had a professional relationship with my Chinese colleague, but he's there to promote the interests of his own country. And that is totally juxtaposed to the interests of the United States, which is to promote a UN system that has strong values, that support a system, a world system that encompasses what the Charter stands for, and that is for the rights of human rights and individual rights in the Declaration of Human Rights, against the rights of a nation to impose its will on its people. So the Chinese have worked over the course of the past 3 or 4 years to put language into UN resolutions, into UN documents that reflect the Chinese narrative. And that's something that we have to really work hard against.
Just last month, the President Biden released his national security strategy, and it outlined a vision of strategic competition with China, which I am confident you share as a president appointee. Do your colleagues in the UN share that? And I'm thinking now especially Sub-Saharan Africa, the what's sometimes called the global South, do they see the world shaped that same way, or would they say we don't want that frame because it puts them in a bad position?
I don't think there's a unified position that the global South has. So there are some countries that do share this approach. There are other countries who've taken a much more calculated approach, that the system is one that benefits former colonial powers. Imperialist might be a word that they would use, but I don't see the vast majority defining the world in the same way that the Chinese define the world. What they're trying to do is find an equation that brings in the needs of the global South, independent of the competition between the United States and China. And the president, I was listening at some of the comments on his meeting with President Xi today, and the president said we have to find a way to have a conversation with the Chinese, to compete with the Chinese, that does not lead to conflict that is not in our interest or their interest.
Right, and some of the readouts from that suggested that President Xi was likewise trying to throw some diplomatic bones, perhaps, in this direction. Is that your read of it as well? That there's signaling some openness?
I don't know if I would describe it as diplomatic bones, but I think it would be a diplomatic approach that helps to define an understanding between our two countries so that our differences don't lead to conflict.
Well, the other half of the president's national security strategy, at least when it pertains to China, is we also have to find areas of cooperation.
Yeah.
And the venue for that would be the UN. Can you point to places in the UN where US and China have been able to figure out ways of working together on matters of common global interest?
We have, interestingly enough, worked together on Haiti. We just passed a resolution that was voted on unanimously on Haiti, and we conferred very, very closely with the Chinese on this because they had been somewhat of an outlier initially, but we were able to come together and come up with an agreement that worked for both of our countries. We also had a unanimous resolution on Lebanon. We have been unanimous in resolutions on Somalia. And, in the area of climate change, we've been generally pretty much in agreement with each other, not in full accord, but with some agreements where we've been able to cooperate with the Chinese on climate change. So there are areas they feel strongly and have been regularly quoted as saying they believe in the sovereignty and the independence and integrity of borders. That's something that we agree to as well. They've not always been honoring that value. And we have reminded them, for example, in Ukraine, where they're supporting Russia, that their statements on Russia does not support the value that they have expressed to support the integrity of borders.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Haiti. That's where I was going to go next in our conversation. Can you talk a little bit about the challenge you see in Haiti? The UN has a very mixed record in Haiti, and how could you persuade, say, the American people to try that one more time, given the record?
Well, we're not going to try it for the moment. For the moment, what the Security Council is considering is a resolution that would give some guidance to a non-UN multilateral force led by another country that would bring in forces that are not under a UN mandate. So that is something we've been looking at over the course of the past month and are working on in response to a request by the Haitian government that we provide them with security to open up their ports. The ports have recently reopened. Fuel is flowing through, but we still have an issue with gangs, and we have an issue with the lack of a political agreement. So the country is basically running without a firm government. We don't have a Supreme Court justice. The legislature only currently has 10 elected officials, and many of their tenures will expire in the coming months. The prime minister was not given a mandate because he was selected by the president, and before he could get confirmed, the president was assassinated. So the country is in political turmoil right now, and desperately in need of a political solution so that the humanitarian and security issues can be addressed.
And let me ask you to speak to this. We just had a midterm election at home, and some of the candidates who ran and won ran on a platform that says we need to spend more attention on our problems at home. We're too busy running around the globe working on other people's problems and paying insufficient attention to our own. Not everybody who campaigned on that did, but many who did campaign that way won. What would you tell them to motivate them to care, say, about the problem in Haiti or the problem in Somalia? You mentioned a couple. Why? Why should the American voter care about these issues?
Well, because these are issues, while they are outside our border, really do impact us inside our borders. If we don't deal with the situation in Haiti, there could be a mass movement, a mass migration, where Haitians will be on the borders of the US, and we'll have to address it on our borders instead of in Haiti. So we need to start to look for solutions that will help us avoid the problem becoming a direct issue for us to deal with. In the case of Somalia, and I really do believe this point, I think the American people do care about seeing people starve around the world. That is something that's it's a core value for us, that so many of our religious organizations are engaged in dealing with the situation in Somalia, in Ethiopia, so that people don't starve. We can't sit and watch people starve elsewhere in the world and not have a sense of responsibility to do something to help. In the case of Ukraine, we've had bipartisan support from the beginning in support of Ukraine. And I think that will continue despite what might come out of this election, because we know that the Ukrainian people are fighting against an authoritarian system that can also attack our own country.
Well, great. And we're now going to transition to some questions from the audience. And the first question comes from one of your former interns. So she's a student here at Duke, and I hope she's not going to ask about the lunch money issues or anything like that related to the interns. But Ruthie Kessery, I think your microphone should be on now. So Ruthie.
Hi, Ambassador Greenfield. I had the pleasure of working with the political office at the USUN this summer, and I was really impressed by the intentionality given to diversity and equity issues. I'm curious about why your office decided not only to include DEI issues, but to emphasize them, and what you feel emphasizing intellectual diversity adds to the work of this office. Thank you again.
this is an administration policy, but more than it being a policy, we believe that diversity is the strength of our country. It is such a strength that no country is comparable to the diversity that Americans bring to the table. That we can be sitting at the table with China and have a Chinese American who is a native speaker of the language that they're speaking, and have that person sit on my side of the room, I think is a powerful, powerful statement to make. To have an African American where the Chinese will sit in the Security Council or in the General Assembly and criticize racial policies in the United States, and think that they're shaming us, where we've acknowledged that we have these issues and that we're addressing these issues. They're part of the greatness of our country, that we can acknowledge our shortcomings and then work to address those shortcomings, and have an African American, and not the first, to sit behind the placard at the United Nations. So I think that we have to project our diversity as one of our tools of diplomacy. It's a strength that I think no other country can bring to the table.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? Are there countries that push back on some aspects of the DEI initiative? Do you find any that are willing to speak out against it?
So far, I've not seen that. I think China, of course, will always resist that, because they will never acknowledge their diversity. They will never acknowledge their issues. When we look at the situation as it relates to the Uyghurs or Tibet, they don't acknowledge that these differences are part of their country's makeup.
Okay, great. Alessandra, you're next. You can unmute and ask your question. There we go. Oh, she's written it in the chat, so let me ask it in case we're having difficulty to get her to speak. She says, to what extent have you seen a shift of attitudes within the United Nations delegations since we've seen rising nationalist and populist sentiments among the populations and authoritarian backsliding within governments globally since COVID? So great question from Alessandra.
Yeah, that is a great question. And we have seen countries' attitudes, I wouldn't say shift, but they have questioned, for example, the fact that during the COVID pandemic, they felt that they were on their own, and the developed world was not there for them. That we vaccinated our own first and forgot them. We have a good news story to tell, however, because we've provided millions of doses of vaccination, millions across the globe. The president committed to 1 billion. During my travels, I traveled to Thailand, I traveled to Gabon, to Niger, and I made sure that in every place I went, I highlighted the contributions that we made to provide vaccines to people, watching them get vaccines in the arms of health care workers and ordinary citizens. So while it was, I think, an issue that countries brought up, I think ultimately we had a good news story.
Next up is Yu Chang. Yu Chang, can we unmute you so you can speak? There we go.
Sure. This is Yu Chang from National Defense University. And luckily happened to get across your last tweet about over an hour ago, saying the world has an obligation to support the Iranian people as they protest for women, life and for freedom. What role, the changing role, is America taking in terms of Russia and Chinese aggression and violation of human rights different from past decade?
You know,
Thank you.
I don't think I think we've had some ebbs and flows on our narrative on human rights. But if you look, we have been consistent over time in calling out violations of human rights, championing people who fight for human rights, such as the brave women of Iran and people of Iran who are challenging that regime's brutal attack on peaceful protesters who are protesting the loss of a young woman's life because she didn't have her scarf on correctly.
I think behind his question, maybe if I could just restate it, would be that the world has seen this play before and they didn't like it. So the U.S. has been bigfooting it around on human rights, perhaps, and not producing a good outcome. That would be one perspective. Or the second perspective is we encourage people to rise up, but then don't follow through, and they pay the price. That might be the other critique. So, is there any validity to
that? Because I think people really want our voices, and when our voices were not there, they missed that. So people who are protesting are not protesting because we're encouraging them to protest. They are being brutalized in their countries and they've been driven to protest. They've had enough. And I think it's important that they hear from others that we support them. We're not turning our backs on them when they protest. We're not going to go into Iran and encourage women to take these actions. They're taking brave actions that might lead to them being jailed, them being injured, and losing their lives. What we're hearing from them is they want to hear from us that we support them. They want to know that the United Nations Human Rights Council stands with them, that the United Nations Security Council will stand with them in their time of need. So I don't think we're turning our backs by any means. We are standing with them. We're giving them the moral support they need. And if they are able to get out of the country, they know that they can seek refuge in the United States or other countries that will open their doors to them.
I'm mindful of your time, and I think you're going to be pulled quickly. I think there's time just for Francis to quickly ask his question, and then you'll have to do the best you can on the answer.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being here, Ambassador Greenfield. I'd like to put a finer point on your framing of the way that China sells their values as, human rights without the human. So why should other countries prefer individual rights in our vision of the UN Charter rather than a vision of, collective rights, collective economic development? We'll throw in a few bridges and hospitals and your country will be great. Why should they focus on individual rights rather than economic development, getting people out of poverty first, and those sorts of things?
Because they all signed on to the Declaration of Human Rights. So the human is meaningful in that term. And so we can't redefine the Declaration on Human Rights to say the human is not important. We all believe in development. We don't think a few bridges will change that. It's going to require countries to lead and really deliver to their people. That's what democracy is about. It's about the ability to deliver to democracy is messy. It's not always a straight shot. There are detours, but I think we all agree that democracy is the best system that we can depend on, that will put the person first. And so I don't think we're redefining the Declaration of Human Rights. We're just focusing on what it means. It means human rights.
Well, Madam Ambassador, your time is precious and you've been most generous with us already. I know there are scores of folks who are keen to ask you questions in person. They'd probably like to work for you as interns or others. So stand by for incoming resumes. When they do get a chance to interact with you, I hope that they'll discover you wearing an AGS t-shirt, which we're going to send up to you in thanks for your visit with us today. It's an elite group of, including UN ambassadors, who have this t-shirt. And I would encourage you to wear that the next time you watch Duke Blue Devils play basketball, football, or any of the many great sports we have. Put on that t-shirt and cheer us on. And in the meantime, we'll be cheering for you and your role on the UN. Thank you.
Well, I can promise you I will wear the t-shirt. I am an avid walker. And I try to do it every single day. It's a little cold now, so the shirt might be under a sweatshirt. But I try to wear all the shirts that I've been given. I've been given quite a few in the year and a half I've been at the United Nations, and I will be honored to wear the Duke AGS shirt.
Well, thank you, and we're honored that you visit us. And with that, I'll say we're dismissed.
Thank you very much.